Something fundamental just shifted in the architecture of global power, and most Americans are only seeing the surface of it. Iran's new supreme leader, Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man the United States killed in the opening strikes of this war, has just issued a declaration that should stop every serious observer cold. In a written statement read on state television because he has not been seen in public since ascending to power, he proclaimed that Iran will protect its nuclear and missile capabilities as a national asset, guarding them, in his words, like the country guards its land, sea, and air borders. He said Americans belong at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. He announced that a new chapter is being written in the region's history, and he made it crystal clear that Iran is not surrendering its technological sovereignty to Washington's demands, no matter how many bombs have already fallen. This is not the language of a regime on its knees. This is not the posture of a government that has accepted defeat. This is something far more complex and far more consequential. And if you want to understand where the world is actually heading, you need to understand what is really happening here, beneath all the noise and all the headlines. Let's go back to the beginning of this, because context is everything. The United States and Israel launched coordinated military strikes against Iran on February 28, 2026. The stated rationale was that Iran was developing nuclear weapons, that diplomacy had been exhausted, and that the threat was existential. Trump announced major combat operations. The opening strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. They destroyed significant portions of Iran's military infrastructure. They targeted nuclear facilities, ballistic missile programs, leadership compounds, and government buildings. Netanyahu declared that Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles had been eliminated, calling it the removal of two existential threats to Israel. The American public was told the mission was essentially accomplished. And then, as so often happens with these grand declarations, reality began to reassert itself. Here is what you have to understand about the nuclear question specifically. Prior to June 2025, Iran had been assessed to be months away from building a nuclear device if it chose to weaponize. Then came Operation Midnight Hammer, the US strikes on Iranian nuclear sites during the 12-day war in 2025. Those strikes pushed the timeline back. US intelligence estimated Iran's nuclear capability was set back to somewhere between 1 and 2 years away from a weapon. That was the achievement. Not elimination, not obliteration. A delay. And here is where it gets deeply revealing. Trump himself, in February 2026, contradicted his own previous claims that Iran's nuclear program had been obliterated. He stood up and said Iran was rebuilding. That contradiction became the justification for launching the 2026 war just days later. So within the span of a few months, the same administration claimed victory and then admitted the victory was insufficient and used that admission as the reason to go back to war. You cannot square that circle if you are operating within the framework the official narrative provides. What the analysts at critical threat institutions were observing throughout early 2026, before the February strikes began, was that Iran had already been rebuilding. It was encasing facilities at Pachin in concrete, building a so-called sarcophagus to harden them against future airstrikes. It was covering anti-drone cages at the Natanz complex. US intelligence found Iran was trying to rebuild nuclear facilities deeper underground. Iran had watched what happened to its facilities in 2025, and it had drawn one rational conclusion: go deeper, go harder, make the next round of strikes more difficult. This is what militarily sophisticated states do when they face repeated bombardment. They adapt. And here is something worth sitting with. Iran made zero concrete progress toward restoring a nuclear weapon in the nearly 11 months between the June 2025 strikes and the February 2026 war. Zero. Not because it surrendered the ambition, but because the damage was significant and reconstruction takes time. And yet the war began anyway. Now we have a ceasefire declared on April 8, 2026, after 40 days of sustained combat. And the ceasefire is shaky, to put it mildly. The Strait of Hormuz, which channels roughly 20% of global seaborne oil trade, remains the central pressure point. Iran closed the strait when the war began. Iran launched counterstrikes on Israel, on US military bases across the region, on Arab nations that house American forces. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia struck Iranian infrastructure in response. UK bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and Cyprus were hit. The RF deployed defensively. The scope of what happened here was not a limited operation. This was a region in open war. And as of right now, as of this moment in May 2026, the Strait of Hormuz situation remains unresolved. Iran briefly announced it open, oil prices dropped 11% in the immediate aftermath of that announcement, and then the situation deteriorated again. Iran imposed new restrictions when the US maintained its naval blockade. Trump launched Operation Project Freedom, a US Navy mission to escort merchant ships through the strait, then paused it because of what he called great progress in negotiations. The US and Iran then exchanged fire in the strait itself. Trump called it a love tap. Oil prices went back up. Brent crude has been trading above $100 a barrel. This is the economic reality of this conflict. It is being felt in gas prices, in shipping costs, in inflation dynamics, and it is not resolved. The nuclear talks themselves are at a dead impasse. Iran sent an updated peace proposal to mediators in Pakistan. The talks are now being mediated by Islamabad after the Oman Channel failed and the Vienna talks never materialized. Trump said he was not satisfied with Iran's offer. He has been demanding that Iran permanently halt uranium enrichment, limit its ballistic missile program, and end all support for its regional proxy network. Iran's position is that its nuclear and missile capabilities are national assets, not bargaining chips. Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader who has not even been seen in public yet, has already drawn that line in his first major statement. The United States demanded unconditional surrender early in this conflict. Trump said in March that only Iran's unconditional surrender would be acceptable. That is not a negotiating framework that produces deals. That is an ultimatum, and Iran has now issued its own counter-declaration. What you are watching is not simply a military conflict, it is a test of whether the post-World War II framework for managing power between states is still operational. For decades, the understanding was that major powers would not simply decide to invade or bomb other countries into changing their governmental structure, their nuclear policy, or their economic orientation without some legitimating framework, some international consensus, some legal architecture, however imperfect. What has happened with Iran represents a departure from that. The US launched strikes during active negotiations. Diplomacy was not exhausted. Iran had made a surprising offer in late February. The Omani mediator said significant progress was made, and Iran's foreign minister said a deal was inches away. The strikes came anyway. The world registered that. China registered it. Russia registered it. Pakistan registered it, and Pakistan is now the mediator trying to hold what remains of a peace process together. India is watching. The global south is watching. And Iran's response, closing the Strait of Hormuz, was not merely symbolic. It was a demonstration that even a heavily bombarded, heavily sanctioned, internally troubled country with protests, with a collapsed currency, with infrastructure under attack, even that country has the capacity to inflict serious economic pain on the world. 20 million barrels of oil per day move through that strait. When Iran closes it, oil markets go into crisis. When the closure is uncertain, markets gyrate. There are currently reports of 230 loaded oil tankers waiting inside the Gulf, unable to transit. Major shipping companies, Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, suspended transits and related routes. This is not a peripheral issue. This touches every American who buys gas, every business that depends on supply chains, every pension fund with exposure to energy markets. Now consider the domestic political dimension of what is happening inside Iran, because this matters enormously to where this ends up. There were massive anti-government protests in Iran in early 2026. The regime cracked down with extensive force. Tens of thousands of demonstrators have been killed in successive crackdowns going back to 2009. The economy was already in crisis before the war began. The currency had collapsed. The snapback sanctions reimposed in September 2025 had frozen assets abroad and imposed severe penalties. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent described the currency collapse as the strategy's grand culmination. And yet, the regime survived. It appointed a new supreme leader. It launched counter-strikes. It closed the strait. It is still issuing defiant declarations. The theory that maximum pressure would produce regime change has now been tested repeatedly by sanctions, by proxy wars, by airstrikes, by blockades, and the regime is still there. This matters because the entire strategic logic of this war, at least as presented to the American public, was built on the idea that destroying Iran's nuclear and military capabilities would produce either regime change or genuine compliance. Neither has happened. What has happened is that Iran's nuclear timeline has been extended, probably to somewhere around 2027 at the earliest, before it could theoretically build a weapon, if it chooses to, under current conditions. But Iran has now demonstrated, through its behavior in this war, that it will not voluntarily surrender those capabilities. It has hardened them, moved them underground, and now its new leader has publicly declared them off the table as a bargaining item. What does the United States do with that? CENTCOM reportedly prepared a plan for a short and powerful new wave of strikes specifically designed to break the negotiating deadlock. Trump threatened further military action if Iran did not agree to a nuclear deal. But here is the fundamental problem. If the previous strikes, the killing of the supreme leader, the destruction of military infrastructure across the country, the 40 days of sustained combat, the naval blockade, the collapse of the currency, the years of maximum pressure sanctions, if none of that produced Iranian surrender on the nuclear question, what exactly would a new wave of strikes accomplish? The logic of escalation without a defined endpoint is one of the most dangerous patterns in modern geopolitics. You add pressure, the adversary responds, you add more pressure, and at some point you are either in a full-scale war with no off-ramp, or you accept a negotiated outcome that looks very different from unconditional surrender. And there is a broader global dimension to this that Americans are not fully seeing in the mainstream coverage. The Islamabad talks, Pakistan mediating between the United States and Iran, represent something genuinely new. Pakistan, a nuclear power, is now positioned as the diplomatic bridge in one of the most consequential conflicts of the decade. That positioning has implications for Pakistan's regional standing, for its relationship with China, for the structure of the emerging multipolar world. Russia and China have both been watching this conflict. Russia's state nuclear agency Rosatom suspended construction at the Bushehr nuclear power plant and evacuated non-essential staff when US strikes came close to it. A quiet reminder that Russian interests and Russian capital are embedded in Iran's civilian nuclear infrastructure. China depends on Persian Gulf oil. When the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, Chinese oil prices go up, Chinese manufacturing costs go up, and Beijing draws conclusions about the reliability of sea lanes controlled or influenced by American military power. What Mojtaba Khamenei said, that foreigners have no place in the Persian Gulf except at the bottom of its waters, that Iran will guard its nuclear and missile capabilities like its borders, is not simply defiance. It is a statement of strategic intent that has an audience far beyond Washington and Tel Aviv. It is speaking to every government in the global south that has watched this conflict and is asking itself, what does it mean that the United States launched strikes on a country during active negotiations? What does it mean that the demand is unconditional surrender? What does it mean to have nuclear capabilities or ballistic missiles under these circumstances? The lesson that multiple governments are drawing from this, quietly but unmistakably, is that being without nuclear deterrence in the current global environment is a vulnerability. That is the exact opposite of the non-proliferation outcome that American policy was ostensibly designed to produce. The ceasefire is fragile, the talks are deadlocked. Oil is above $100 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz remains a daily flashpoint. A new supreme leader, unseen in public, is issuing declarations of permanent resistance. The United States is threatening new strikes while simultaneously declaring that hostilities have terminated. A legal argument designed to avoid congressional approval requirements under the War Powers Resolution. And somewhere beneath all of this is the original question that was never honestly answered for the American people. What does success actually look like here? Not what are the stated goals. The stated goals shift. Not what the administration claims. The claims contradict each other. What would a genuine resolution of this crisis look like that leaves the United States, Iran, the region, and the global economy in a stable and sustainable configuration? That is the question that matters. And right now, nobody in a position of official power seems to be asking it out loud.